Welcome to the Typical Skeptic Podcast, where we dive deep, you decide. Questioning the matrix, from UFOs, where the shadows unknown reside. Rob Khalil busting myths like ghosts in the night. Paranormal pros, secret space ops, yo, we keep it real, no fright. Typical skeptical, seeking, never sleeping on the lies. Aliens, Anunnaki, black ops in disguise. From abductions to ancient scripts, we flip the script wide. TSP style, mile after mile, truth can't hide. Hold up, TSP crew assemble, we dismantle the fable. My lab's targeted souls breaking out of the stable. Dogman howling, Bigfoot prowling, cryptids in the mist. Mandela the fifth twist in reality, can't resist the twist. Soul trap snapping, reincarnation mapping, holographic dreams. Near-death visions, out-of-body missions, waking up the teams. No censorship here, we fear no elite scheme. Conspiracy kings ringing bells, hear the freedom ring. Skeptical seeking, never sleeping on the lies. Extraterrestrials into the...
Welcome to Typical Skeptic Podcast. Be sure to like. Welcome to Typical Skeptic Podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Typical Skeptic Podcast. This is episode number 2756, and I have with me the amazing Richard Syrett. He's a Coast to Coast AM longtime host, and he's also the host of his own show, Strange Planet Radio. I've been a fan of Richard's for quite some time now. I even told him before the show that I relate to him and Connie Willis the most. Like, I grew up on Art Bell, and George Norrie and George Knapp, but I always tune into their shows the most. But I wrote a little blurb about today. Rock music has always been more than entertainment. What if some of history's greatest musicians left behind mysteries that still refuse to be explained? Join me as I welcome legendary broadcaster, author, and longtime Coast to Coast AM guest host Richard Syrett to the Typical Skeptic Podcast for a fascinating discussion on his new book, Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. We'll begin by discussing Richard's remarkable journey through radio, podcasting, and decades of interviewing some of the biggest names in the paranormal, UFO, and conspiracy communities before diving deep into the hidden side of rock history. We might explore the Beatles and psychological warfare, Jimmy Page, Aleister Crowley and occult symbolism, Elvis Presley and unanswered questions surrounding his death, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison and the 27 Club, intelligence agencies and cultural engineering, counterculture and hidden influence. Then I might ask Richard a couple questions about the current UFO disclosure after we talk a lot about his book, and then Richard's experience as Coast to Coast AM. As someone who grew up listening to Art Bell, this conversation is very meaningful to me. Richard has always carried forward that tradition of exploring the unknown with remaining thoughtful, curious, and open-minded. This won't be just another book interview. We'll connect the dots between music, mystery, hidden history, and the bigger questions that continue to shape our world. Bring your questions and join us live, and I'd like to give him a big warm welcome to the show. I'm bringing him to the stage now. Richard, thank you so much for coming on. How are you?
Hey, Rob. I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I listened to a lot of your interviews to prepare for this, and I'm not sure if anybody asked you this first question. Before we get into the hidden history of rock and roll, did anybody ask you yet, like, how did your journey begin? Like, I heard your story about how you got Coast to Coast, and I'd love for the audience to hear that. But like, how did you get interested in the paranormal and UFOs? Like, were you always interested as a kid, and did you always know you wanted to do like broadcasting?
I think in the back of my mind, it was sort of a seed that was planted and it was growing, even if I didn't acknowledge it to myself. I grew up in the late 60s and 1970s, and I watched a lot of television as a kid. I was the youngest of five. And so, I had great parents, but occasionally the television was the babysitter. I can't imagine how my mother managed five children. So I I grew up on a lot of reruns. I watched, the Twilight Zone, and I watched um, Night Gallery, which was another Rod Serling program, and um, Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of was a big influence. And I watched a lot of talk shows. And I remember, it was too late for me to stay up to watch The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, but my brother and I shared a bedroom, and we were right across the hall from my parents' room, and our bedroom doors would be shut, but I could hear they had a TV in their room, and I could hear my parents laughing as they were listening to The Tonight Show. So that's a very early memory. And I used to love watching talk shows on TV, Merv Griffin and Mike Douglas and all of these luminaries that would appear on those programs. I remember Mike Douglas interviewing John Lennon and one in particular, Mo Howard from the Three Stooges, for those who remember the Three Stooges. And he was quite old at that time. But so that was my world. It formed a lot of the memories that I have as a kid, watching television. Yeah, I got outside and I did all the normal things that kids do, played a lot of ball hockey, and we had a huge park across the street from us, 40 or 50 acres of forest, really, and we played a game called Capture the Flag. So I don't want to leave people with the impression that I was a shut-in or that I was, just like a mushroom growing in my parents' basement. But I did watch a lot of TV, and that was an influence. And then I went away to college in the 80s, and I gravitated naturally towards radio and television. There was a radio and television program in Toronto, radio, television, and film, actually. Graduated, thought I was going to get into television documentaries. And in the meantime, a classmate alerted me that there was an opening for a call screener position. Call screeners are the people that screen the telephone calls that come in on live talk radio programs. That now they call them on-air producers. So I thought, well, I'll just, I'll apply for that until something comes up in television documentary. Well, it didn't take very long for me to fall in love with the medium of live radio. And I was working with some legendary Canadian broadcasters at CFRB in Toronto, a 50,000 watt heritage radio station that's been on the air since 1927 and had the longest running morning man, I think, in radio history, Wally Crowder. I worked with an American broadcaster who came up to Canada, Ed Needham. He was one of my first gigs in talk radio. I was his call screener. I learned a lot from him. And then about a year later, I moved into the late night slot, and I was working with a guy named John Oakley, who was a comedian, but he was a terrific interviewer. And I think we were doing it was the overnight show, maybe 1 a.m. to like 4 a.m. or something ridiculous. But he used to bring on some really wild guests. And then I became not only his call screener, but his off-air producer or his chase producer. So I would book the shows. And I was like a kid in a candy store. I mean, he would go out golfing during the day. He would come back and sit down and say, "What do you got for me?" And I would have the whole show laid out for him. And, whatever I wanted to book within reason. So those were my early days and then I became kind of a character on his show, an occasional on-air sidekick, and he would kind of make fun of me, and that was fine. Anyway, had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Then in 2000, I got my own show. And I had to figure out, well, what am I going to do with, a 3-hour program? What am I going to talk about? And Art Bell was really the only guy out there that was talking about UFOs at that time anyway, UFOs and the paranormal and conspiracies. And I thought, well, that's an underserved serviced market, I thought. Maybe, I can be the Canadian version of that. Not that I was Art Bell, but there was no Art Bell in Canada. So that's where it began on a Sunday night at CFRB in 2000. And then the show kind of moved up and down the dial in Toronto. And eventually it became the conspiracy show on Zoomer Radio. That radio show morphed into a television show. We sold it internationally. It aired for 5 seasons. It's still available on Roku, I think. Excuse me, I think. And then in 2014, I got the call from the executive producer at Coast to Coast asking me to be a regular fill-in guest host. And I continue to do that to this day. Here we are almost 13 years later, filling in Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, 2-3 times a month. And it's the greatest platform out there in live radio as far as I'm concerned. And I love late night audiences. And so here we are, and my latest adventure is writing. And this is my first book, Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone.
Yeah, and I just want to say before we get into that real quick, I love your intro when you start off Coast to Coast. Like you'll say whether you're in your parents' basement or the greasy spoon off the interstate, and like it sets the tone. I'm sure you have that memorized. What you say, like you say a couple different things, but like it sets the tone perfectly for late night radio. You know what I mean?
Thanks for inviting me into your home, your long haul truck, your RV, your taxi, your parents' well-appointed basement with the electric fireplace, simulated wood paneling, and the painting of dogs playing poker. Yeah, our loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate. Yeah, that was actually inspired by. I grew up in Brantford, Ontario, and my best friend lived right next door. I had a really idyllic childhood. All my friends lived in the same block, and we went to school together. We played together, and his name was Lawrence Dowling, and he that's his basement I'm describing. He had he had the electric fireplace in the basement, and the simulated wood paneling, and he had that famous painting. Everyone had not everyone, but it was very popular in the 60s and 70s. It was a dog sitting around a poker table playing poker. I don't know who created that, but that's based on my childhood chums' basement. We used to call them rec rooms, recreational rooms, rec rooms.
Yeah, that's really cool. So your latest venture, Tales of a Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. Now, this started off as a podcast, correct?
Correct. Yeah, in 2018. Well, actually, first it started off as an idea for a terrestrial radio show. My late partner and good friend R. Gary Patterson and I got together, and he was a rock historian, and we used to call him the Fox Mulder of rock and roll for those fans of the X-Files. And so much of what I dedicated the book to him. So much of what I learned about this arena, rock and roll meets the paranormal, I learned from R. Gary, because he wrote about these things, several volumes of books, including the definitive book on the whole Paul is Dead legend. It was called The Walrus Was Paul. And so we got together. He was a regular he was a regular guest on Coast to Coast AM. Then he became a regular on one of my shows. And so when we got together, we decided let's get together and come up with an idea for a show. It was originally going to be called The Spirit of Rock, and we'd actually got the attention of a radio station in Knoxville, Tennessee. He lived near Knoxville, and they were getting ready to. They wanted the show, so we were going to do a live show. I would co-host from Toronto, and he would co-host from Knoxville, and we would talk about rock mysteries. And then he died unexpectedly. In fact, the last chapter of the book is all about a very strange phone call that happened the day or night that he died. After he died, after a period of grieving, I decided that Gary would want me to forge ahead with the project. So I took the idea to Chris Jericho, the famous WEF or what do they call it now? The World Wrestling Federation. It's something now. I don't know what they renamed it. Anyway, he was a famous wrestler. He's a musician, and he also is a terrific interviewer. He had his own podcast network. And so I took the idea to him to turn it into a podcast, and I renamed it the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. And in 2018, I produced 40 or so episodes. And in the last 8 years, people have been asking me, write a book. You need to write a book. You have to write a book. What are you going to? So I decided I would revisit that podcast. And I took 16 stories from the 40 episodes, transcribed them, and then I preserved all of the interviews. I mean, I interviewed some great experts and researchers and music journalists, and musicians, people, who played with Jimi Hendrix, for example, like Juma Sultan, who played with him at Woodstock. Steve Ubaney, a terrific author and researcher who wrote the definitive book on the idea that Elvis may have been murdered. It was called Who Murdered Elvis Presley? So I lean on a lot of great researchers and journalists. Anyway, I preserved those interviews, so they're all in the book as they are in the podcast. But then I rewrote the narrative to make it a little more cinematic, a little more literary, maybe, because I didn't want to just transcribe it and publish the transcription, because it's not a podcast, it's a book, so it has to be in a literary type form. One of the cool things I think about the book is at the end of each chapter, there's a QR code. And if you scan it, it'll allow you to listen to the podcast. And the podcast, The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, is not available anywhere at the moment. I may put it back out online at some point, but the only way you can listen to those old episodes is to get the book, scan the QR code, and then it'll take you to the episode that inspired that chapter.
Yeah, I was looking it up last night. I was trying to find episodes of it, and like you said, it's kind of hard to find. But I saw there was on Listen Notes, and I have an audio podcast, so I'm familiar with Listen Notes. So I saw it was on there, and I saw that the Bob Marley episode was 2 episodes. So I said, "Wow, this must be a massive psyop or conspiracy that or what happened with Bob Marley." Could you get into it a little bit? It seems so interesting that the CIA would be interested in killing Bob Marley, and then if you think about what his music was preaching and what he was talking about, which was love and unity and that's what it seemed like, at least maybe that they would want to put the kibosh on that.
Yeah, the Marley episodes, maybe they'll make their way into volume 2 if I do a volume 2, if people enjoy the book and enough people want to, get back into it, I'll do a volume 2. But so now I have to remember back, because as I say, it's not in this book, but the Bob Marley episode. Well, you had to understand Jamaica in the 1970s. Jamaica is blessed with a lot of mineral resources. Bauxite, for example, which is very important in the production of a lot of important industrial products. I think aluminum and steel production are required. Bauxite's required. So it has a lot of strategic importance for the United States. The CIA was very interested in what was happening politically in Jamaica at the time, and they had a very left-leaning government there that was kind of cozying up to Cuba, communist Cuba. And so that had the interest of the CIA. And unfortunately, Bob Marley, who tried to remain, apolitical for the most part, he was a very spiritual person, but for the most part, apolitical. I mean, he was concerned about the plight of the poor, and he supported a lot of poor families in Jamaica. He didn't care about, personal wealth or money, really. But he was used, I think, by the left and the right in Jamaica, and both of the ruling party and the main opposition party, they had their own sort of paramilitary units. They were armed gangs, really. And caused a lot of violence, and they clashed and so forth. And so they were vying for Bob Marley's support, and he didn't want to give one to the other. He didn't want to be politicized. But unfortunately, he got kind of manipulated, I think, by the left, and he was holding a series of these sort of peace and love type concerts, and the ruling party kind of took hold of that event and made it look like he was campaigning for them, and he really wasn't. So a short time before one of those concerts, there was an assassination attempt, a number of armed individuals, and it's not 100% clear who they were and who they were working for, but they attacked Bob Marley's home while he was in rehearsal. And they shot his wife. I think she was hit in the head, but she survived miraculously. They shot Bob Marley's It was his manager. He was hit numerous times in the back. He survived. Bob Marley was hit, survived, obviously. And there's a very famous film, and he's performing like several nights later, and he still has the bullet lodged, I think, in his arm. And he was told, all of his entourage, his family, his wife said, you can't go out on stage. I mean, they just tried to kill you. But he was insistent. He was going out there. Nothing was going to stop him. And he's on stage, and there's a scene where he's holding his arm out like this, pleading to the audience, peace and love and all things, like he's holding this giant grapefruit in his hand or something. And people may not be aware, if they don't know the backstory, that while he's performing that, he's got a bullet in him. So there was that assassination attempt, a lot of discussion about who was responsible. Was it a rival gang? Was it the paramilitary group that was aligned with the more right-wing opposition because they perceived that he was supporting the left and so forth? Was it the CIA? Then, of course, Bob Marley ended up getting cancer. I think it started with an infection in his big toe. I think it injured his big toe. He played a lot of soccer. He loved football, as they call it down there. And it got infected, and I think it developed into cancer. And eventually that cancer worked its way up into his brain, and he passed away from that. He sought treatment in Germany and so forth. There's a lot of speculation, and I get into that in the episode. Some researchers, conspiracy theorists have claimed that the CIA gave Bob Marley cancer. They put something in his soccer shoe or something. We investigate that. I talked to some journalists and so forth. I don't know that really has legs, if I can put it that way. But it's an interesting theory. We examine it, investigate it. Ultimately, the listener has to make up their own minds. And as I say, it's not in this book. Maybe it'll end up in volume 2. But it's a long, involved story. That's why it takes up 2 episodes.
Wow, that's fascinating. And going into the book, your book simply isn't about famous musicians. It seems like it's about hidden history as well. Like, what was the larger story that you were hoping readers would kind of take away from it?
I would say a couple of things. One, and this doesn't just pertain to the world of rock and roll or music, pop culture. It's really, just look at the news cycle. And the idea is that the official narrative that's being fed to us from whether it's a government institution or whether it is the mainstream media, the official narrative, which is kind of spoon-fed to us, it's not necessarily wrong. In some cases, it's polar opposite from the truth, we later discover. But it's not always wrong. It's just often incomplete. So that's something to keep in mind, and I hope that's something that readers take away, that the official narrative that we get isn't always the whole picture. It's just maybe a selective part of it. The other thing is that history or certain documents or facts that come to light aren't necessarily suppressed. Sometimes, for sure, they are. Sometimes they're just ignored or they're forgotten. So those are 2, I would say, messages maybe, or lessons that I want people to come away from in the book. But I do, as you say, it's not just about mysterious deaths, for example. There is a whole section about, it's called Killer Riffs. And the idea that, Brian Jones, founder of the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, Elvis Presley, and Kurt Cobain, the official narrative, surrounding their deaths is sort of case closed. Brian Jones died of drowning, death by misadventure, accidental drowning. Elvis Presley died of either a heart attack or a drug overdose. Kurt Cobain took his own life. Jimi Hendrix aspirated on vomit from barbiturate poisoning. Those are the official narratives, but I reopen those cases and I think, shine a light into some dark corners and come up with an entirely different narrative. But it's not just about that. The entire first section of the book is called The Beatles' Enigma, where I investigate whether the Beatles and Beatlemania was some organic cultural phenomena, or whether it was engineered. Section 2 chapter 2 in the Beatles Enigma investigates the whole Paul is dead legend, this idea that he died in a car crash in 1966 and was replaced by almost an exact double, so that the Beatles could continue on. Now, spoiler alert for the record, I don't believe Paul McCartney died in a crash and was replaced by a double, but the clues, the breadcrumbs that we can find on the album covers of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, that whole album cover is just a funereal scene, a collage, a funereal tableau, if you will, it's just littered with clues. That's, Paul was supposedly killed and replaced. There are clues in the songs in what we call backward masking, where if you play the song backwards, if you don't wreck your needle on your phonograph, you can hear John Lennon sing, I think it's in Strawberry Fields, where he says, I buried Paul. I buried Paul. Or in Dream Number 9 from the White Album, we can hear Lennon, I believe it's Lennon, say, turn me on, dead man, turn me on, dead man. That's just a smattering of all the clues. So I go through all the clues. But to me, what's fascinating about the whole Paul is dead legend, again, I don't think it's true, because if it's true, they had to find someone who looked almost exactly like Paul McCartney, sound like McCartney, play left-handed bass, and was arguably even more talented than the Paul McCartney that was killed. Because if you look at the body of work of McCartney after 1966, Hey Jude, Let It Be, The Long and Winding Road, all his solo work, Baby I'm Amazed, his work with Wings and so forth. I mean, it beggars belief, really, or disbelief. To me, the fascinating thing about that is, as a sociological sort of thought experiment, this happened, and the legend took off in 1969. People our students at a university in Iowa, in Davenport, were calling radio stations. They'd put all these clues together, and they were telling these DJs, hey, did you know that Paul is dead? He died in a crash, and here are all the clues. They called Roby Young at WABC in New York. They called Russ Gibb at a radio station in Detroit, and it just took off from there. This is before social media. It's before the internet. And here we are 60 years later almost, and there are still many people who believe McCartney was replaced by a body double. And they're still, following the clues and so forth. To me, that is absolutely fascinating.
You know what else I find fascinating? When you said that when you play the record backwards, that you could hear him say Paul is buried or Paul is dead. That made me think back to the guy. I think his name was Paul Oates or David Oates, that used to come on Art Bell and do reverse speech. I've actually had him on my show.
Oh, yeah, David Oates. Yes, I remember David. I know David. Yeah.
Yeah, these reverse speech patterns, which I find fascinating, because it seems like the truth comes out in reverse speech, whether you're doing it through a record or you're doing it like David does. I know he has his own techniques and stuff like that. So do you think the truth can come out and stuff like that?
Well, I think with the reverse speech analysis, he's taking, the forward speech from someone who's not consciously, creating backward speech, where with these clues and the backward masking, and I don't think it's pareidolia, this, the psychological thing where we're wired for pattern recognition as humans, so that we're going to hear certain things that aren't necessarily so, but once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Or, someone who sees an image, I don't mean to be disrespectful here, but let's say, they make a grilled cheese sandwich, and they see an image of Jesus in the grilled cheese sandwich. And if you look at it and you finally see it, you can't unsee it. But it's pareidolia. It's not really there, but we're wired to see patterns, pattern recognition. That's pareidolia. The Beatles' clues are deliberate.
Yeah.
Reverse speech with David Oates, that's not conscious. It's not deliberate. But these clues were deliberately placed there. The question is, was it just clever marketing, or was it, as I propose, a psyop, a psychological operation to see if they could get people totally focused on this, the Paul is dead legend, and just become obsessed with it, which they are and were.
Yeah, that's fascinating. By the way, one of the ones I wanted to dig into, and I kind of told you this before the show, was the whole Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain thing, which is kind of touchy because like people were still alive in this, right? Or Courtney, but I told you I was at Lollapalooza here in Pittsburgh in like 94, 95. I was like 15 years old. It was one of the first big concerts I ever went to. And, someone threw a shotgun shell on stage and she just quit. I mean, obviously, I mean, like if she, I'm sure she loved her husband. I mean, regardless of whatever, I don't know what happened, but like, it seems like there was some shady shit that went on with this. Excuse my language, but it seems like she could be, I don't want to say she's implicated, but yeah, could you talk about this a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Allegedly, reportedly. We have to use those words because these are just allegations, never been proven in court. She's denied any wrongdoing. That's important. So according to the law, she is absolutely innocent until proven guilty. And it's kind of timely, Rob, because back in February of this year, there was an independent forensic team that approached King County in Washington, where Seattle is. Of course, Kurt was found dead in Seattle at his home. They wanted King County to reopen the case, either the police department or the medical examiner's office. And all the evidence that they talk about in their report, you can find in the book. And that is, questions about the death scene, the shotgun that he used to take his own life, the levels of, I'm not going to use the name of the drug because that can be tricky for YouTube. Well, we'll call it brown. People in the know. The level of brown that he injected into his veins, multiple times the lethal dose, wouldn't have been able to, handle a shotgun. There's the so-called suicide note, and the handwriting analysis that's been done. A lot of questions surrounding all of that. So anyway, King County has refused to reopen the case. And unfortunately, Kurt was cremated, coincidentally or conveniently, perhaps. He was cremated. So, it's not like his body can be exhumed and they can do any further study on that. There's also the matter of the person who performed the autopsy. This I learned later. This didn't end up in the podcast in 2018 or subsequently in the book, but it turns out that the doctor that performed the autopsy on Kurt later said that he should have recused himself from the case because he didn't come out and say he was intimate with Courtney Love, but maybe he did intimate. He didn't come out and say it point blank, let's say, but he sort of intimated that he and Courtney may have been intimate, lovers, in other words. Can you imagine the person performing the autopsy on the victim is intimate, has intimate relations with the victim's wife?
Wow.
So that's kind of troublesome, to say the least. Then there is the whole, I mentioned the suicide note. The first, and this was found, the note was found kind of stabbed into the soil of a flower pot in the greenhouse where he was found. It was a converted room above a garage at their home, converted into a greenhouse. An electrician found him on April the 8th, 1994. So the suicide note, the first, say 95% of it is in one particular type of handwriting style, which matches with Kurt Cobain's style, but it's not overtly sort of, a suicide note. He's not saying, I'm going to kill myself and I can't go on and so forth. It seems to be, if you read it, more of a love letter / apology to his fans, and an explanation as to why he's stepping back from not only Nirvana, but the whole music industry, wants to spend more time with his daughter, Frances Bean. That's the way it reads, at least to me and many other people. The last 5%, let's say, of the note reads more like a suicide note. Courtney, I can't go on. You'd be better without me. Frances Bean will be better without me. That definitely reads like a suicide note, but the handwriting is totally different. It doesn't match. It doesn't match. I mean, you don't have to be a forensic analyst, handwriting analyst to see that, but a number of forensic handwriting analysts have looked at it and they said definitively it's not a match. Now, where it gets real interesting is that Kurt and Courtney had a family lawyer. Her name is Rosemary Carroll, and she was recorded by a private investigator named Tom Grant, who paradoxically was hired by Courtney Love. And then he later figured out, hey, there's something strange going on here. He interviewed Rosemary Carroll, admitting that she discovered in Courtney's backpack what she referred to as practice sheets, handwriting practice sheets, where it appeared allegedly she was trying to copy and imitate, let's say, Kurt's handwriting style. Why would she do that? Why would she have practice sheets in her backpack? We also know that Kurt was in the midst of changing his will, but he hadn't signed it yet. And had he signed that, had that will gone into effect, all of his money, all of his royalties, and he's consistently listed as one of the top earning dead celebrities of all time. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars now in royalties over the last 32 years. All of that money would have gone to Frances Bean, his daughter, not Courtney Love. Well, he didn't sign it because he supposedly took his own life. Wow. So those are just a few of the strange things surrounding, again, rush to judgment, rock star, supposed heroin addiction, supposed history of family mental illness, supposedly he was depressed. Look no further. Obviously, it must have been a suicide. Well, step back, look at the inconsistencies, and that determination, I think, is in serious, serious question.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's so interesting. One thing I wanted to touch on was some of these rock stars' interest with like the supernatural or like the occult. Like I know you in your book you write that Jimmy Page had a fascination with Aleister Crowley. It's rumored that Elvis used to. I interviewed a guy one time. He told me that Elvis used to carry around like supernatural or esoteric books with him, and it seemed like, Jim Morrison was also like very like esoteric or occult. Like, did you find this a lot in the book, and do you explore that?
Chapter 6 is all about Led Zeppelin and the occult, in particular, Jimmy Page's not only a fascination, I would say obsession with Aleister Crowley, who referred to himself as the Beast 666. Aleister Crowley wouldn't have referred to himself as a Satanist or a Satan worshiper. I'm a Orthodox Christian. I would view Aleister Crowley as someone who dabbled in Satanism. Not dabbled, he was immersed in Satanism. But Jimmy Page was an occultist. He opened a bookstore in London called the Equinox, and it dealt exclusively, I think, with Aleister Crowley, artifacts, manuscripts, books. Jimmy Page owned first editions and original manuscripts from Aleister Crowley. Anything that came on the market, he would buy it. And so when Boleskine House came up for sale, Jimmy Page purchased it. And Boleskine House was purchased by Crowley, I think, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It was on the shores of Loch Ness in Scotland, very isolated, very remote. He purchased it because he wanted to perform a ritual called the Abramelin operation, where he would summon what he called his, I think he referred to it as the ultimate guardian angel. I would refer to that as, as a demonic entity. And it required months and months of preparation, fasting, and discipline, and again, isolation. And it happens in stages. He would summon a series of, according to the protocol of this operation, you would summon a series of I'll call them demons, and then you would bind them, and then you would go on to the next level and summon more demons and bind them, and then more demons and bind them, and then ultimately and finally you summon this ultimate demon. But halfway through the operation, or at some point, Aleister Crowley gets called away to Paris, France, suddenly, and he leaves Boleskine House. but he didn't bind the demons entirely. He didn't complete the Abramelin operation. And as soon as he left, all these strange things started happening at Boleskine House. And he had a property agent who managed the estate. And a number of people had tragic endings, including, I think it was either the agent or a gardener, suddenly, who was a lifelong teetotaler, didn't really or abstained entirely from alcohol, suddenly became a raging drunk and murdered his own family. There was the village butcher who had received a note from Aleister Crowley, deliberately cut off his own hand with a meat cleaver. All sorts of strange paranormal activity in the house. Anyway, zoom ahead half a century or more, and the house is purchased by Jimmy Page. Jimmy Page decides to summon his bandmates to perform some kind of an occult ritual. They all attend except for bass player John Paul Jones. He didn't want any part of it. John Bonham was there. Robert Plant was there. And I don't know that they necessarily understood what was happening or why they were there or what they were doing, but they decided to play along for better or worse. And they were assigned occult sigils or symbols, which you can see. They're on Led Zeppelin 3, I believe. In fact, Led Zeppelin 3, you don't see the name Led Zeppelin. You don't see the individual band members' names. You just see their sigils, because Jimmy Page believed that these had occult power. He believed in ritual magic and the power of it. And he wanted the band, he was performing these rituals because he wanted the band to achieve massive success. And they did, obviously. But at what price is the question. And I go into the tragedies that befell not only members of the band, but hangers-on, members of the entourage, backup singers, recording engineers dying suddenly and inexplicably or in tragic accidents. And then, of course, Robert Plant was in an accident himself. His family were vacationing in Greece. He was almost killed in a car accident. I believe he was confined to a wheelchair for a period of time, maybe even performed on stage in a wheelchair. Later, tragically, his son, Carrick, becomes ill suddenly and dies at the age of 4 or 5. Horrible, horrible situation. Jimmy Page becomes a heroin addict. John Bonham, of course, dies, drinks himself to death in early 1980. Were these misfortunes and tragedies the result of Jimmy Page and his obsession with the occult, ritual magic, and Aleister Crowley? I can't say for certainty. There's no smoking gun document, but I believe when it comes to the occult, whether you're sincerely embracing it or whether you're dabbling with it for marketing purposes, let's say, which is very common in rock, that's an invitation. And when you invite something through the door, it can have consequences. I believe in an unseen world. I believe in angels. I believe in demons. I don't apologize for that as an Orthodox Christian. So I take these things very seriously.
Yeah, I agree. Dude, going back to Crowley, do you think and I don't want to go too far up, but I listened to a lot of different people on conspiracy theories and UFOs and aliens for a long time. And I know people have different theories, but a lot of people say that Crowley, when he was performing these rituals, could have opened up portals, and that's where supposedly the Greys could have started coming from. And then it's interesting because shortly after that time, I guess you do see a maybe an increase in I don't know if we could make a correlation to that in Grey abductions or alien contact, because it's weird because some people say that alien contact goes back thousands of years. That's why we have the show Ancient Aliens and other stuff. So, do you think there was any correlation with what Crowley did in the UFO alien phenomena?
Perhaps, particularly if you look at 1947, and there was a real uptick, let's call it, in UFO activity, not only UFO activity, but paranormal activity across the United States. And when we hear 1947, we automatically think of Roswell. But it was before Roswell. The Kenneth Arnold UFO sightings over Mount Rainier in Washington, that was pre-Roswell. There were other UFOs. There was the Aztec UFO incident where a craft allegedly crashed in the desert and bodies were discovered. But there were a lot more than just those 2 or 3. There were many, many, and people were also reporting other strange encounters and paranormal activity. So how does that link up to Aleister Crowley? Well, there was a rocket scientist, self-taught rocket scientist by the name of Jack Parsons, whose name JP became those initials became, instead of Jack Parsons, it turned into the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but it's really the Jack Parsons Laboratory. And he was creating things like solid rocket fuel, which he claimed came to him in some sort of occult communication, the formula for solid rocket fuel. And he was a devotee of Aleister Crowley, along with L. Ron Hubbard. And he performed rituals in the desert. And I believe it was a place called Devil's Gate, appropriately named. And it is theorized that he opened a portal, very similar to the Ibrahimaline operation. And he was killed a short time later in an explosion. I don't know if his solid rocket fuel, blew up or what happened, but he died. And perhaps, as happened to Crowley at Boleskine House, he didn't properly close that portal. And what came through was responsible for the huge UFO paranormal flap of 1947 and beyond. People look at 47 as sort of the birth of the modern day UFO phenomenon. Yes, there were sightings, multiple sightings before 1947. It didn't begin in 47, but it certainly escalated in 47.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That is. Going back to the book and the some of the musicians you covered. I wanted to touch on the 27 Club. I've talked about this in past episodes. It says, I've talked. It seems like the 27 Club continues to captivate people like decades later. And you get into each of the people that have like Hendrix and Morrison, and maybe Cobain was even 27 when he passed.
Yes,
yeah. Like, what do you think? Do you think there's some kind of supernatural? I don't even know what to that, or do you think it's just coincidence or something else entirely?
I don't discount it, that there's a supernatural, metaphysical aspect to the 27 Club. First of all, I should point out the 27 Club. When we think of the 27 Club, we think of sort of the big four. Brian Jones, 1969, founder of the Rolling Stones, dead at 27. September 1970, Jimi Hendrix, dead, 27. October 1970, it was a bad year for rock and roll. October 1970, Janis Joplin, 27. July 1971, Jim Morrison, 27. And then we forgot about it for a while. But so those are the big four. And that's where we really start talking about the 27 Club. But you could go all the way back to the 1930s. Robert Johnson, and I cover Robert Johnson and the Curse of the Crossroads. It's a very famous myth or legend. 1930s, he was 27. He was the king of the Delta Blues, allegedly made a deal with the devil at the Crossroads down in Clarksdale, Mississippi. The Crossroads are still there. There's a plaque there. Robert Johnson is often considered the great grandfather of rock and roll because the Delta Blues combined with Negro spirituals and the blues and rhythm and blues and jazz sort of all coalesced to become rock and roll. He was 27. So and the list goes on and on and on. It's hundreds of names, including the original keyboardist with the Grateful Dead, Pigpen. I can't remember his last name. McKernan, I think his name was. He was 27. After Jim Morrison in 1971, we didn't really talk too much about the 27 Club, even though there were other members who were, they continued to pass away at that age. But then 1994, Kurt Cobain, 27, we start talking about it again. And then 2011, Amy Winehouse was 27. So there are two ways to look at it. And the first one is the more prosaic, practical explanation. So at the age of 27, a lot of musical artists have sort of achieved the pinnacle of their creativity. And, because they start performing quite young and they start writing music quite young. And at 27, the pressure on them is unimaginable. It's enormous. They are touring nonstop to the point of exhaustion. They have incredible pressure from the record companies. You got to write another hit. We need another top 40 single. We need another successful, smash album. And then you have to go out and tour endlessly in support of that album. The pressure is unimaginable. You've got their fans who won't leave them alone. No privacy. So what do? Well, if you're 27, the human brain doesn't really fully develop until you're about 25. And that's why young people do reckless things, because their brain hasn't fully developed. Well, a lot of these musicians they're surrounded by people who will not say no to them. They're surrounded by people who just want to get in their good graces, and they'll do anything for them, which includes, getting them drugs and alcohol and so forth. So they're surrounded by it. And that's a deadly cocktail when you think about it. Easy access to unlimited drugs and alcohol, enormous pressure. It's a deadly cocktail. And so, unfortunately, oftentimes it ends that way, badly, tragically. That's the prosaic explanation. The supernatural explanation, did they make some sort of a deal, a Faustian bargain? And we've been writing about Faust, the Faustian bargain. And Faust, for those not familiar, back in the 1500s, he was an actual guy. He was an alchemist and an astrologer. I think he was German. The great writer Marlowe, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare, writes about Faust and this deal that he made with Mephistopheles, who was this essentially a demon or the devil. He wanted fame and fortune and talent and so forth, and he gave it to him for a period of 24 years. And at the end of that 24 years, he died, and he gave up his immortal soul. That's the Faustian bargain, and it's been written about many, many times. Goethe, the great German writer, wrote about Faust and many others. So did they make some sort of a Faustian bargain, and their death at 27 coincided with the end of that contract? That's, possible. I think we all make Faustian bargains. Maybe not literally with, scrawling our name in our own blood and, writing a contract in front of the devil. But in a measure, we all make deals with the dark side for fame or fortune or whatever. There's also kind of an interesting astrological aspect to this. And I don't necessarily believe in astrology, but it's interesting when you're born, Saturn, the planet Saturn, which is a very powerful, symbol in astrology. Saturn appears at a particular place in your birth chart. It's funny that about 27 years later, not exactly 27, it could be 28, could be 26, but around your 27th year, Saturn returns to the exact same place in your astrological chart, almost like a completion or resolution. Could that have something to do with it? Perhaps.
I have to agree with you. I felt like I had my Saturn return. Like I'm kind of 50-50 on astrology, but like I had like the worst year of my life when I was like 29 and 30 years old. Like I'm 46 now, so obviously I made it through it, but it was just like, it was insane. And then years later, people told me that could be like your Saturn return. And I was like, oh, maybe, I don't know. But I mean, like, it does seem weird that like people kind of experience weird stuff around that 27 to 26 to 30 year age. That's bizarre. Wow. Just two more questions before we finish up, because I know we're running short on time. Was there any particular rock star that really like stuck out to you in this book? Where, I mean, it seems like they were all interesting, and I know you covered Elvis, Hendrix, Morrison. I mean, Brian Jones. You kind of covered the whole gamut of like, rock stars in this. Was there one that really stuck out to you that seems like really unanswered, or like one that you enjoyed covering the most?
Well, I have to say, I don't know if I would use the word enjoyed, because we're dealing with, we have to remember these are human beings. They've become these legends in our mind, and we forget, they left loved ones behind. They were actual, living and breathing people. Yes, many of them were deeply troubled. They were self-destructive. Some of them weren't so nice to other people. I mentioned Brian Jones. He was a real piece of work. I mean, there's a saying, genius is difficult to work with or to live with. Brian Jones, I think by any measure, was a musical genius, but he could be mean. I think he'd fathered 6 children by 6 different mothers by the time he was like 18, and just left them. So not always a nice man, but he was a human being, and he died under very mysterious circumstances. I learned a lot in that podcast episode and in that chapter, speaking with some great authors and researchers. Again, a rush to judgment. I was not aware until I did the research or spoke with these researchers that when Brian Jones died and it was ruled death by misadventure, accidental drowning, he was found at the bottom of his swimming pool in Cotchford Farm, where he lived. It was the former estate of the great British writer A.A. Milne, who brought us Winnie the Pooh and Christopher Robin. He bought that place to get away from London and the spotlight, and then he was fired by Keith and Mick because he was spiraling downwards. He was not able to perform with the band anymore. They fired him 2 weeks earlier. Found at the bottom of his swimming pool. I wasn't aware that the person who performed the autopsy and quickly, again, I'll call it a rush to judgment, ruled death by misadventure and accidental drowning was not the medical examiner from Sussex, England. That's the person who should have performed the autopsy. That's where Brian died. He would have had jurisdiction. The Prime Minister, I believe it was Harold Wilson at the time, stepped in and appointed his own personal physician all the way up in London to come down and perform the autopsy on Brian Jones. That to me is fascinating and very suspicious. Why? Why would the Prime Minister get involved? Why would he appoint his own personal physician? What else was going on that night at Cotchford Farm? Who else was hanging around Brian Jones that night? And why might one of them wanted him dead?
That's amazing. And guys, you guys can all get this in Richard's new book, Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. It's on Amazon, I believe. And we have a little bit of time so you can promote that. I just wanted to ask you one more question. It's not related to the book. I would feel kind of amiss if I didn't ask you about this, especially with what's going on today. I know you've interviewed countless UFO researchers and government, secrecy. Where do you think we stand with UFO disclosure today? It seems like the government's releasing a lot of files. Some people say it's kind of BS and it's not, and then some people even point to experiencers having better footage than what the government's releasing. And I don't know, I'm kind of like 50-50 on it. I mean, so do you have a particular stance on where we're at with disclosure, or do you think we're in the midst of disclosure?
I don't know that we're in the midst of disclosure. We're in the midst of we're in the midst of a titanic struggle to control the narrative, whatever that might be. And I have my own views on what the whole UFO ET phenomenon is all about. It's not necessarily a popular one in certain circles of the UFO community, which is maybe why I don't get invited to the UFO conferences. But I don't think we're seeing disclosure as maybe we imagined it or we're hoping for. I think what we're seeing are this ugly battle that's going on both backstage and in public to see who's going to control the narrative. Is it going to be the government? Is it going to be certain entities within the government? Is it going to be scientists? Is it going to be UFO disclosure advocates? There's this titanic battle going around, and there's a lot of misinformation, and a lot of it is coming, I think, from the government, and it's deliberate to sort of muddy the water. I don't know that we're ever going to get disclosure as we imagine it, and I think there's a good reason for that. And this gets back to my own personal view, which I'm happy to share. And again, I have a bias. My bias is I'm an Orthodox Christian who believes in an angelic and demonic realm. I don't think we're dealing with extraterrestrials. This is the unpopular part. I do believe we're alone in the known universe, the seen universe. I do believe in interdimensionals. The Bible talks about hyperdimensions. It talks about an angelic realm, a demonic realm. I think that's what we're dealing with. And a lot of materialists aren't happy about that. They don't want to talk about that. but that's the only thing that makes sense to me when I put it through my faith filter. It's the only thing that explains what they are, where they come from, and why they're here. So we're never going to get a government agency or the president of the United States or anyone, walking up to a podium at a press conference and saying, everything you read in the Bible is true. These are demonic or they're angelic, and there's nothing we can do about it because, they have technology or abilities far beyond our control. That's never going to happen. To what extent do they really understand that that's what's happening? I have no idea. But that's to me, that's the truth about the UFO ET issue. And we're never going to get that coming from the government, or scientists are never going to admit that.
Yeah, I'll just say real quick, I've always thought about the whole abduction phenomena, like why they have to come covertly in the night and like steal men and women's reproductive things. And it was very bizarre. It always seemed like it was almost like they were doing something covertly. I know people have stories of positive contact and astral experiences and stuff like that. But as far as like the abduction phenomena, it seemed like it was always done covertly. I've heard of people getting abducted in cars in the middle of the day as well, but it's always like done very, I don't know. It's like, why can't they just come up and introduce themselves and say, do you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like they kind of hide in a way or something.
Well, I don't discount that people are having some positive experiences. Part of that could be part of the deception. Part of it could be maybe a genuine encounter with, let's call them the good angels, not the fallen angels, but the good angels. So they could have positive experiences. But even people like Jacques Vallée and others, Nick Redfield. Is it Nick Redfield?
Nick Redfern.
Nick Redfern. Thank you. Nick Redfern. I haven't talked to Nick in ages. They are coming around to this, and Dr. David Jacobson are coming around to this idea that they are not benevolent. These are malevolent, and they have a sinister agenda. And there is an element of deception. They've written about this and talked about this publicly, and I think some they're coming around to this idea ultimately. That's what we're talking about here: interdimensionals from the angelic realm.
Oh, well, I know we're out of time. This was an amazing interview. Thank you so much, Richard. I just wanted to say, if you have the floor to promote your book and anything else you want to promote, thank you so much for doing this. I really enjoyed this. This was an honor.
I enjoyed it too, Rob. It's great to meet you. So Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, Eerie Enigmas and Supernatural Secrets from Rock's Darkest Corners is available. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, I think even Walmart online. You can get more information about the book. You can even read some sample chapters at therockandrolltwilightsone.com, therockandrolltwilightsone.com. I have a podcast that drops Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It's called Richard Syrett's Strange Planet, and the website is strangeplanet.ca. The YouTube channel is at Strange Planet Radio, if you'd prefer to watch the podcast rather than listen to it, but it's available. The audio is Spotify, Apple, iTunes, wherever you get your podcast. And I continue to guest host on Coast to Coast. I'll be guest hosting live from Los Angeles, August 28th, 29th, and 30th, live from the studios in Sherman Oaks, California. So I'm looking forward to that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Richard. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in today, and everybody who's going to watch afterwards. And I'll be live later on today. And thank you, guys. And thank you, Richard.